Have you here?
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, I'm going to put myself on mute and stop video, but I'll come in every once in a while to make sure. And if there's any problem at all, just text me, Susan. I'll have my phone with me. And I'm going to listen to it later. It's being recorded. Thank you, Alex, so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you
We're
again.
having lots of vagrant birds.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, we're having an exciting spring, as we do, I guess, every spring. Wouldn't you say, Eric?
Yes, I would agree with that. It's and the pace is picking up, but really it starts in March and goes until December.
I was going to say until March, but
Hi, Alex. It's Chris Field. I just realized that I co-authored a paper with you with Ian McLaren on.
You did, yes. I was going to talk about that at some point. Yeah, great to meet you.
Great to meet you. We'd never, I don't think we'd ever met, and I had to dig up the paper to remember what on earth we did in that paper.
Yeah, regression trees. So I won't go too much detail, but yeah.
Yes. No, it seemed to be a decent paper as far as I could remember.
Yeah, quite highly cited for a niche topic on vagrancy. So
yeah, no, great. So you're still working in you're interested in vagrants and things like that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So that's what I'm talking about today. I mean, it's not my sort of primary research interest, which is sort of tropical bird conservation, I guess, more than anything else. But it's certainly sort of a secondary research interest, and obviously just written a book on it. So spent a lot of time thinking about it recently.
Yeah, I have to admit, your name sounded familiar, and until I dug up the paper on Google Scholar, I didn't remember you as the co-author with it. So
yep.
Had a very good master, one of the best master students I've ever had, who did most of the statistical analysis on it.
What's going on here?
Just exit of that.
Yep.
Why is it?
And Alex, when I started posting that you were coming, someone texted me and said that she had banded birds with you many years ago. I think it was Angela or Andrea.
Yes, yeah, at ABO, yeah, 20 years ago now.
Yeah. Have you been back to Canada or Nova Scotia recently?
I haven't. No, I haven't been back to Canada at all. I did spend a year at Cornell, so not a million miles away. But yeah, I'd never made it up to Canada in that time. I had some invitations to go to Tadoussac, which all the Cornell folks kept going to. So obviously saying really good things. But yeah, I'm sure I'll make it over there eventually again.
Yeah.
Always a bit more tricky when you're going from sort of out there. I still have to deal with visas and everything else as well. So.
Well, we get lots of good birds here.
You do indeed, yeah. I still like to get to seal at some point. Not to seal, to sable rather. I always used to think about a lot. Sort of read Ian's book cover to cover several times about that.
Yeah. Yes, and next Thursday night we have Greg Stroud, who's the operations manager at Sable Island, speaking with us. But it'll be 7 p.m., which is probably bedtime for you.
Yeah, getting on a bit then. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to make sure I can connect with Diane in a rush if I need to.
Hi, everybody. There's not much chat going on this evening. What's happening?
Oh, you just missed it.
Ow. Something went ping all of a sudden.
Did you do that, Tony? That was really, that was uncalled for.
I'm sorry, old boy. I'm sorry. But there you go. There's one big question for Alex, of course. We have to ask this gentleman. Does he support Manchester United or Manchester City or the amazing Leicester City? I mean, I'm just checking.
Well, to be honest, yeah, neither at present. Although my neighbour is an ex-Manchester United player from the 70s, so If I were to, you know, if I were caught wearing a blue shirt, I'd probably throw a wheelie bin at me or something. So yeah.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Mm,
Unless it's a Leicester City blue shirt.
indeed, yeah.
Nothing to do with vagrancy, but I thought people might be interested. I had supper outside for the first time this spring because it's lovely and warm here in the valley. And right throughout my supper, I was serenaded by a mockingbird and a cardinal, which were trying to outdo each other in terms of song. I couldn't record it, but I did get pictures. Just kind of nice to hear. I'll see.
It's about 12 here on the Cape and windy, but I did have my first mockingbird today, actually, on my travels, which was nice to see.
It's in northward range expansion for that species in your neck of the woods at the moment.
Yeah, it seems to be. It's still in little pockets, I think, but in the right habitat, there's far more. I mean, mockingbirds are just kind of, I wouldn't say they're trash birds, but they're pretty common. Yeah. They're also quite aggressive. Anywhere near the nest, they dive bomb you. They behave like skewers and terns and so forth.
So are the black-bellied whistling ducks still down around Cape Fortune?
Unfortunately, no. I had a message from a neighbour saying we've got these weird odd ducks at the light. I was working, which I am again, unfortunately, and I contacted Angie. She blasted down next, it was like 2 minutes walk. And yeah, there were 10 black-bellied whistling ducks sitting by the roadside. They're just, as far as we can tell, flown in a few moments before from somewhere, possibly the ones that were in Maine. And they rested for 2 or 3 hours and started getting a bit more active. And then they were last seen flying across to Sunday Point. And they landed in a creek there on the inflow and were eating heartily. And then the next morning, gone. Who knows where they are?
Well, they showed up, or they maybe, or some others showed up in Newfoundland within the past couple of days.
Yeah, I think the Newfie birds were before these, and the main ones, I think it was 11 in Maine, were not seen until last seen a couple of days before ours turned up. So ours might be the main birds, who knows?
You know, they get around. There was a group on the Eastern Shore several years ago.
Yeah, I remember those Muscadava.
Well, beyond Musquodoboit, but anyway, that group, I photographed that group, and it disappeared. And a few days later, a group showed up in Massachusetts. And in the group that I photographed was a bird with a bill anomaly that made it totally identifiable. And it was in the group in Massachusetts. So they had made their way undetected to the North Shore of Massachusetts in about a week from here, where they were in between. Who knows? Maybe they went direct. Anyway, they can cover a lot of ground, they do.
You got many people.
There's a raging argument at the moment, and at least promoted by one person in Newfoundland, that these are actually escapes, which I sincerely doubt myself. I think it's a natural occurrence. Alex, you had something?
I was going to say, well, I'd certainly agree that a flock of 10 is probably unlikely to be escapes, certainly, and they tend to turn up in flocks and migrate in flocks. But I was going to say, if anyone doing sort of nocturnal migration monitoring, because obviously they're very noisy at night, whistling ducks. I used to get them flying over my apartment in Brazil all the time. So an easy bird to pick up on these sort of knock mig recordings.
Yeah, we've got an audio moth in our garden, but it's only recorded for like 15-20 minutes at a set time in the morning. Just it produces so much data. We haven't reviewed it this week yet, but from what we can tell, these ducks turned up early afternoon. It was foggy. They just appeared. I think they were flying and breaking the fog, saw some land and came down.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they could have been over water for quite a long time, potentially. So.
It was nice to see them. Even
I've
better
seen-
if they've been in our
I
yard.
did see some up in upstate New York. I had a flock in, I think that was June time there, sort of in the Finger Lakes region.
So,
Apparently their natural range is expanding northwards as well.
Yeah,
So we may see more of them in the future.
yeah.
Another sort of vagrant, I guess, is that the Wilson's phalarope at the Port William sewage pond was seen a couple of days ago. I've been twice, couldn't find it yesterday or today. Just before logging on this evening, there was a message from Devon Johnson that it's back there towards the edge of the North Pond, if anybody wants to go. Oddly enough, it was one was there same time last year, and about 20 years ago, I remember the same thing happened, whether it's the same bird, but there's something about the North Pond of the Port William sewage plant that attracts Wilson's phalaropes.
Oh,
So-
probably is good habitat, but it could easily be the same bird retracing the same migration route, even if it's, you know, massively out of route. It'll still do the same thing if it's done its migration successfully.
Oh, was it up while they're just talking to Allison while I.
What'd you say?
Oh, what's happening? Oh, look.
I had both great crested flycatchers in my yard today. The one's been hanging around, and today I saw him checking out a tree cavity. So I'm not sure if they'll nest there, but I'm pretty sure they'll nest somewhere nearby. So I think they did last year.
So Alex, I wondered, did you write several papers with Ian over his career?
I guess we just wrote the two. So one I'll sort of mention to start with, which is on a rare bird occurrence, and then the ibis paper, basically. So I think just the two. That I was in contact with him up until, you know, a couple of years ago, essentially. So almost right to the end. So yeah, he was always a sort of great person to bounce ideas off. He was always giving me an update on what he was up to, and
Yeah.
so yeah, amazingly active. Yeah.
He was a very careful scientist. I remember, you know, writing the papers with him. He didn't let me get away with any statistics. He kept me very honest.
You say statistics in such a negative way, Chris.
Ken.
Guess we're all dumbfounded by the celebrity speaker, or we're all birded out.
I was trying to work out what
Yeah, or
subspecies
something.
of white-crowned sparrow that was on Lance's photo, because I can't remember the ID criteria for subspecies of white-crowned sparrow anymore.
Well, you look at the laws, and the Western one has white laws, and the Eastern one has black laws. That's the simple version, but there's about 4 subspecies actually. The other interesting thing with that family of sparrows is that I'm sure you know that the song of the white-throated sparrow is changing, and George Forsyth, who I don't know, George, are you online here or not sure? But anyway, he recorded the new song for the first time in Nova Scotia a few days ago. So it's kind of heading eastwards.
Yeah, so lots of that sort of proper cultural evolution and propagation of new song types. It's come to a head here in the UK with the Crossbill situation.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but we have this sort of our only endemic species is this Scottish Crossbill, and it can essentially, there's actually no distinguishing feature left for it, because the only distinguishing feature we had for it was song type, and actually none of them have made the call type they're supposed to make for like 10 years now. And then someone's recorded that call type for the supposedly endemic bird in France. So it's basically game over for the Scottish Crossbill. Although looks like red grouse is going to be split. So based on the phylogenetic work that's been done recently, so won't be any loss. We're down to one endemic again.
What's the situation with redpoll taxonomy in the UK these days?
We're just sort of listening to what's been coming out of the States on that, and I think I think they'll probably all fall eventually. Trying to deal with common versus lesser redpolls in or rebird sort of super review of the UK as well is always a nightmare, because people say, well, this essentially has got most of the phenotype features of common redpoll, or mealy redpolls we call it there, and saying, well, it's not an invasion year, it's unlikely to be one, and most of these features are actually, you can find these in lesser redpoll. And you're like, well, it's just not a species anyway. If you just stop talking about them, it's much easier. And you can just smile when you see a Hornemans because it's amazing. But it's all gone a bit CSI birding here, with lots of taxa now being done just based on DNA, basically. Lots of difficult taxa, which are now things like every have to catch every subalpine warbler, because they've been split 3 ways now based on deep genetic differences. But you've only got shallows. Well, you've got vocal divergence, but plumage is incredibly difficult with them. So there's a whole sort of suite of taxa now, which are just sort of poo-only birds, basically. But British birders sort of embrace that, so everyone's always running around through a Steineger's stone chat to get poo or whatever, and gets sent to Aberdeen, and Martin Collinson sequences them, and we get an answer.
We're waiting for. Sorry.
That doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, some people have complained about it quite a lot, right? But it's just, I guess it's the concepts of taxonomy, right? We're a diurnal visual primate. How we try and make sense of the world isn't necessarily exactly how the world is. So, I mean, you can either ignore those things, or you can, you get an inkling it is one, but to be 100% sure, you need the DNA. So it works, I guess. Not everyone likes it. Not everyone likes even the knock-mig stuff. People getting like rare birds flying over them in the night, which and then pretty soon we'll be hooking up. Look at how good Merlin is now. We could be getting remote autonomous devices finding birds on Sable Island and sending a message back telling you there's a metapipit on Sable Island right now, and the whole process will have been automated. So we're not far from that now.
Takes the fun out of birding, though.
It does in a way, right? But it's not going to find everything, but it will find stuff that otherwise wouldn't be found.
Yeah.
I think it's all complementary for me.
We had a Tamarensis gull in Nova Scotia just over a year ago, and the person who found it, Angela McDonald, she's managed to scrape up some poo, and she sent it off. But I don't think we've got a result yet.
No,
because nobody knows what that is.
Well, gulls are terrible though. Even with DNA, you often struggle with those. So
yeah,
so much integration across all those lineages.
I think what happened with that one is they didn't have another Tamir gull to compare the sample with. That was the issue.
Yeah, well, if it's not in gene bank, then you're in trouble. So yeah, it's the same is true for other things as well. We had a rufous bush chat here, which a vagrant, and that didn't match any known rufous bush chat. Trying to work out if it was eastern or western. It was like, well, this population is unsampled where this bird came from.
I don't think the Russians will be sending us a Tamir gull anytime soon either, for some reason.
Probably not, no. Yeah, really bad for Russian science, all of this.
Well, luckily we got that stellar sea eagle before all that happened.
Yeah, send that over here. Jump across to Iceland, to Greenland, then to Iceland, and then to Shetland.
It might already be there. You never know. You got lots of nice rivers with salmon. So
Yeah.
lots of stuff comes that way over here. It's not that big of a leap to see it go back.
No, we've got those invasive Russian salmon as well at the moment. Speaking about the Russians, so I think the Pacific ones that were introduced into northern sort of European Russia about a decade ago. They've now made it all the way to Scotland now. So they'll probably eat those as well.
Let's go.
So after 6, should we be starting?
Tony, are you ready to start?
I'm all good. Shall we begin? Well, welcome everybody. It's a special event hosted by the Nova Scotia Bird Society. Tonight's presentation is Avine Vagrancy, Pattern, Process and Prediction by Alex Lees. I'm Tony Miller, the Vice President of Nova Scotia Bird Society. And as you hopefully know, you've heard of us, we've got over 400 paid members and a Facebook following of 22,000 people. Oh my God. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the birding friends from outside Nova Scotia, across North America and into Europe as well, who've had an interest in vagrancy sparked by our, I call it the stellar sea eagle, I mean, wherever it happens to be right now. We're delighted to have you with us this evening. I'm excited that Alexander Lees, co-author of the book Vagrancy in Birds, is here, even though it's like after 10 o'clock in the UK time, to help us learn more about how and why this birds show up in unexpected places, like the eagle, like heck, our black-bellied whistling ducks recently. Alex is a senior lecturer at the Manchester Metropolitan University, an associate of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and a lifelong birder. His research focuses on the impacts of global change on biodiversity. Like many of us, Alex was out birding early on Global Big Day. I believe he acquired 62 species that day, just for a few hours, which is pretty impressive. I also know you had a couple of northern lapwings on your list, and we've had a few of those showing up in Nova Scotia on and off recently, which is good. So without more ado, shall we say, we'll share the screen with Alex, if you could please do that, and let's get some information on vagrancy. Thanks very much.
Okie doke. So I'm hoping you can see my screen now. If I maximize that, is that looking all right?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. So again, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys tonight. I'm a lifelong birder, and I guess I've always been, as many birders are, right, who aren't necessarily scientists, sort of intrigued by, why rare birds show up. And there's sort of the book and a lot of these thoughts are the sort of product of, hundreds of conversations in the pub with friends, many who aren't academics, about vagrancy. And a lot of the books and a lot of the material that's been written about vagrancy are also not written by academics, or just written by birders. So it's sort of, everyone's sort of an academic when it comes to vagrancy, because there's a lot we don't know. And in many ways, this talk will be about a lot of things that we don't yet know. But I think this is why it's really interesting. And for me, and I'll try and build into this, I think it's actually really, really important, not just knowing, why things show up, but actually the ecological importance of things showing up, if you know what I mean. Hopefully they'll become clearer later on. But if you think about this right from the get-go, there would be no endemic birds on islands if there were no vagrants, because there would be no colonization and the long distance, resulting from these long distance vagrancy events. So I think it's actually quite a powerful phenomenon in biogeography and in ecology. So I hope you'll sort of leave this talk having sort of an appreciation for potentially the sort of wider importance of this phenomenon. I'm going to start my timer here, because otherwise I can be speaking for hours on end if I'm not careful. So great to be speaking to folks from Nova Scotia. My background ontogeny, if you like, sort of ornithological development, also sort of paid a visit to Nova Scotia about 20 years ago this autumn, indeed, so September or August to October 2002. I spent about 2.5 months at the Atlantic Bird Observatory on Bon Portage, and then on Seal Island, and got to, apparently it was a really bad autumn. I know sort of Blake Maybank wrote a newspaper column about me visiting and how there wasn't any birds, but I still had a great time and found some cool birds, including this LeConte sparrow here, which was, I guess, the rarest bird that I found in the autumn, extracted from a mist net and processed. And my first, I guess, sort of little academic publication was this sort of nature note, if you like, on this first record of Nova Scotia. So I feel like a bit of a debt to the province and sort of my ornithological development, if you like. So back to sort of big picture stuff then, and birds are an incredible taxonomic group, right? I mean, they have this vigility, this ability to move large distances in space and in time, which, you know, virtually no other group of organisms, you know, can manage. And I remember there were some sort of academic papers that get published, and you almost sort of remember where you were when they happened. And the story of the bar-tailed godwits is one of those, it's almost one of those stories. So when we found out that satellite tagged bar-tailed godwits of the Siberian race Bowerai, they can migrate non-stop, you know, from Alaska to New Zealand in one go. You know, this sort of 11,000 kilometer migration, you know, lasting over a week. People were completely blown away by this. You know, it's this incredible sort of reimagination of what birds, you know, were capable of, and these feats of avian endurance. And subsequent to that, actually, there's been loads of other papers. Things as small as northern wheatears can cross, you know, seemingly from Greenland to West Africa in one jump. And we know that great snipes, a European bird, which is flying over land. It's not like it's constrained by having to, you know, like the bar-tailed godwits, they can't land on the ocean. They do a similar migration route, thousands of kilometers, you know, they're sort of a slingshot straight from Scandinavia all the way down to East Africa, and they just don't bother to land. You know, it's just a migration strategy. So, you know, this new technology is sort of really pushing back the boundaries of what we understand birds are capable of. Whilst at the other extreme, right, there are still many species of birds which have an incredibly limited capacity for dispersal. I spent a lot of my life working in the Amazon basin and sort of conservation issues there, and working with understory bird species, which, you know, people have done like dispersal challenge experiments on these things. They've like taken them out into open areas and released them, and these birds physically can't fly more than 20 or 30 meters. So, you know, between a scale-backed antbird, which is exhausted flying, you know, a few tens of meters, you have a bar-tailed godwit, which can fly 11,000 kilometers. So you have this amazing sort of gradient of dispersal in birds. And with these sort of little understory birds here, it's, you know, narrow forest dividing roads can come to structure entire communities. So this is just sort of just showcasing a bit of this stuff that my normal day job, but how that relates then to patterns of avian dispersal at sort of at large spatial scales. So I don't know if anyone here would know what bird is being looked at by hordes of birders here. Hordes of birders being a tabloid expression you tend to see in newspapers in the UK whenever something really rare turns up. Does anyone recognize this picture? So this was the scene in November 2006, I think it was, off the top of my head, when a long-bill murrelet showed up at Dawlish Warren on the sort of English south coast. So that was at the time the second Western Palearctic record. The first actually was found drowned in a fishing net in Switzerland. So obviously long-bill murrelet then is this, you know, small Pacific seabird. This is a photo of that bird here, it's taken from the book here, and here's some coverage in the BBC News. And incredible, obviously, because long-bill murrelet is essentially a small Pacific seabird, you know, sort of breeds around sort of Kamchatka and Chukotka, and then moves further south to winter sort of far south as the sort of Koreas and Japan. And so what, you know, what the hell is this bird doing, you know, in a seaside town in November in the UK, right? But obviously looking at a single record, what does that tell you? Not necessarily much. When we start putting all these records together, actually, can you see my mouse here moving around the top right or not? Not sure with the screen sharing here if you can see it.
Yep.
Yep.
You can. Great. So this is the Devon record here, and this is the Swiss record. Actually, a Romanian record, which I didn't pull off here because I pulled these records from eBird. No one obviously entered that here. But then we have a load of different records from across the North American continent of long-billed murrelet, plus some extremitotal records here in the Bering and further south towards China. So we have this picture of sort of hyper dispersion in records of this specific seabird, which ordinarily should be just migrating 1,000 kilometers or so south to winter here. And there are records right across the North American continent and 3 now from Europe. And this phenomenon then, repeats itself time and time again. And people have sort of made inquiries. Often there's lots of speculation that accompany, the first reports of this species in the sort of standard, quite not very sort of quantitative, if you like, birding journal accounts of, the bird looked like this, and Smith found it and took a picture of it, and lots of people came to see it, and we had no idea what was going on. Those sort of accounts, and then we have started with, even with long-billed murrelet, there are sort of some nice quantitative studies that start asking questions about, well, what was the body condition of these birds? Are there spatial patterns in where they've turned up, and can we interpret those in light of which way the bird should be migrating, etc. But there's still a lot of unknowns. We still don't know what causes long-billed murrelet to do this, but we do have now a portfolio of possible reasons why that might be. But the ultimate reason, it sort of still escapes us. So there's still a lot of mystery involved in this. It's also possible long-billed murrelet may even breed somewhere in Alaska. Perfectly possible that there might be some small undetected population. So there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to some of these rare bird occurrences. But taking a step back even further, right? Well, what is vagrancy, right? And it obviously means different things to different people, and looking at definitions and such like. But for birders then, and for ecologists, it means an individual which is found outside of its normal geographic range. And again, that's a bit problematic. So, like, how far outside? If it was like a tapacula, a small species of Andean cloud forest passerine bird, their range is limited by sort of elevational contours, and it would almost be more unusual to find some Andean tapacula 400 meters further down the mountain than it is to find a long-billed murrelet on the other side of the world. So how far they have to be out of range to be a vagrant sort of depends on life histories. And obviously, normally, when we get towards a species range edge, it gets rarer. So although we look in the maps and we see these beautiful, well, historically at least, you saw these nice fixed boundaries, ranges are more dynamic. And if you have, again, look at Cornell's new STEM maps, you can see how ranges tend to peter out. And I'm not just saying when there's an abrupt coastline or an island, ranges naturally peter out as we move through different habitats. So deciding exactly where a species is a vagrant and not a vagrant, or maybe it might be a scarce migrant, etc., is problematic. But broadly speaking, it's a bird out of range. And in our book, we talk about 2 different forms of vagrancy, which you probably not encountered these definitions before, but I'm sure you've all recognized that they exist. So one is what we might call endogenous vagrancy, or sort of internal, if you like. So the idea that a bird has gone out of range because of some internal problem with that bird, an ability to navigate correctly. Some of that navigation mechanism is somehow damaged in some way, or it's inherited some deviant orientation which caused it to go the wrong way, or it's diseased, or it's disabled in some way that's not able to interpret some of the star compass or the sun compass, which I'll go on to talk about in a bit. These internal mechanisms have to migrate. So it's a problem with the bird, which caused the bird to be in the wrong place. And then we have exogenous, which is external vagrancy, and that's where perhaps this bird can navigate perfectly well, but on its migration route, it encounters a hurricane. That hurricane takes that bird out of range. So, there are lots of causes which might be endogenous and exogenous, and they're not mutually exclusive either. A bird might be going slightly the wrong way, and then it hits a weather front. So it might be a combination of those 2 things, perhaps. So thinking about some possibilities here, endogenous might be normal non-migratory dispersal over large distances. So, not all bird species are migratory, and migration itself is a continuum from, you know, highly migratory species through partial migrants through to residents. But even residents need to disperse in some crucial parts of their life cycle, you know, to find their territory. And if a bird, you know, leaves its where it was born, has to move around through the landscape, find somewhere to set up its territory. Now, you know, if that bird does not encounter suitable habitat, it might find enters an area where it's out of habitat. It may continue to keep moving to try and find some suitable habitat, and may end up then out of range, for instance. And just like lots of sort of facets of natural science, you know, we see a sort of a distribution of dispersal distances, right? Most individuals don't go very far, but you have some which go a bit further, and you have very few which may go a very long way. Think about perhaps in that case the sort of the wanderings of the stellar seagull, for instance. You know, a few individuals, you know, there might be only one a generation or whatever do something that's really crazy, but we expect to see that sort of normal distribution of dispersal distances. But that's endogenous. It's driven from within the bird, if you like. And then we have, you know, failure to navigate correctly, or a failure to stop at an appropriate time. You know, you might be going the right way, you know, but your internal clock, if you like, that says, right, I have to migrate for X days in X bearing. If your clock doesn't stop, then you end up overshooting where you're supposed to be, either to arrive at your breeding area or to arrive at your wintering area. And then, you know, injury, you know, some physical injury to the bird might cause it either to not be able to fly correctly. It might struggle to move up and down through the boundary layers of air, which we'll talk about later on, or, you know, could be some sort of, you know, brain hemorrhage or whatever, you know, something which is interfering with the bird's capacity to behave in a normal fashion. And then exogenous, external cases, well, the weather is obviously the big one, and as birders, you know, we're often sort of students of weather charts, and we know predictably, you know, when migrants and vagrants are likely to turn up, because they're affected by all these different weather systems on migration. So, you know, birds can be quite predictable in space and time where they turn up. There are also other external causes like eruptions, and again, eruptive species like, you know, crossbills or northern owls, or, you know, various different species, particularly boreal species, but also I guess sort of some nomadic desert species also fit into this sort of bracket as well, right? But imagine if you're dependent on a food resource which every now and then disappears. You have to move out of your normal range, or move out to a different part of your normal range in order to find food. You know, if you fail to find food and you continue to do so, then you're not going to stay and starve. You're going to continue to move out of your normal range to try and find food. So that will be an external, exogenous cause of vagrancy. And again, this idea of the distribution maps is also kind of interesting for these eruptive species, because we have this normal distribution for them, and then we have a much larger distribution where we come to expect every few years, you know, we will find these species, right? So, and then changing climates, you know, both historically natural changes and the contemporary, you know, changes enhanced by human activity are also reshaping bird distributions, and very, very quickly. So, you know, we have to think about how sort of dynamic and plastic the distributions of birds are in space and in time. So trying to pick a bird in sort of North America that's like ultra resident, so wren-tit's a good example, really cool species because it's like the only old world representative of like the Sylvia warbler complex. So, you know, I've got like 5 species in a similar family breeding, you know, next to my house here, and this bird is amazing when you think about it. It looks just like a Dartford warbler and behaves just like a Dartford warbler, an old world species, and indeed it's in, you know, it's in the same sort of family, or at least the same part of the avian tree of life. And a bird like this Dartford warbler, which is extremely sedentary, you know, virtually no records of vagrancy. You can think of various birds of the sort of desert southwest, if you like, which periodically occur in Ontario or whatever. You know, there are scarcely records of wren-tits further than a few tens of kilometers out of range. You know, it's extremely sedentary. It's not likely to be missed elsewhere. It's just this bird doesn't move. But, you know, we can look at other species which are resident, such as the western subspecies of red-shouldered hawk, and banding recoveries tell us, you know, a lot about this distribution, normal distribution in these birds. So here's the range of the sort of western subspecies of red-shouldered hawk here. And so a paper here, Bloom et al., published about a decade ago in Condor, of the 109 red-shouldered hawks they recovered, basically 3 of those would be vagrants. So 3 of those were recovered outside of the mapped geographic range of the species. This is basically 5, 3, and 9 here. And 5 was only just outside. 3 was in Nevada, and 9 was pushing all the way into Utah. So 843 kilometers out of range for a non-migratory species. So that young red-shouldered hawk went wandering. It went wandering and wandering, and then it didn't find a mate or didn't find territory, wasn't occupied. It then left its geographic range, probably then might have found habitat which might look to right, or maybe the settlement cues, the sort of the things in its brain that said this is a good place to look, to stop, weren't met. And at that point, it's no longer finding other red-shouldered hawk. So maybe a bit like the Steller's eagle, it's just going to continue wandering. In the case of the eagle, it's like, well, the habitat looks great, it's loads of fish, there's other eagles, but there's no Steller's eagle. So again, probably that bird isn't going to stop wandering either, because it's going to continue to look for a mate, essentially. So for migratory species, to sort of understand the causes of this endogenous, this internal vagrancy, then we need to think about, well, what can go wrong? So to understand what goes wrong, we need to have a quick bit of revision about, how do birds migrate? So birds use sort of any of like 4 different avian compasses. So one of which is using the sun to orientate, another is to use the pattern of polarized light, 3 is to use the star compass. So lots of young birds spend a lot of time looking at sort of gaining a map of the stars. And the 4th is the Earth's magnetic field. Now, lots of beautiful experiments have been done on migratory birds to prove that the utility of all these different compasses. And most birds, don't just use one. They can use multiple compasses as like a fail-back mechanism for navigation, basically. But the first crucial step then that birds need to take in order to migrate is basically identify north, and then they need to angle themselves, with respect to north and the direction they need to travel. So they need to be sort of finding a reference point and then facing that reference point, which corresponds to, in many species, a genetically predetermined migratory direction. So we know for many bird species that migratory orientation, that direction they want to head in is herited from their parents. And again, lots of beautiful experiments, crossbreeding in different individuals, different populations to show you get this sort of average heading and such like. That's not true of all birds, though. In some birds, migration route is culturally learned. Things like cranes and geese, for instance, follow their parents to learn where their migration routes are. So that's not the same true of all birds. And also birds kind of, especially birds which migrate in flocks, they kind of crowdsource orientation as well. There'll be push and pull in the flock, which direction they want to go in. And so many birds migrate in flocks, or indeed, even if we think about waders and everything else, but even warblers are migrating and making flight calls, nocturnal flight calls at night, so they can keep in contact with other warblers. And they're sort of, again, crowdsourcing the orientation a bit as well. So imagine then, if you get step 1 wrong, identifying north, well, you have what might be nominally termed reverse migration, right? You then, instead of going south, you head north. And then if you get step 2 wrong, it's what we call mirror image misorientation. You might, instead of going southeast, you head southwest. Or it might be the case that these mistakes could be in any compass direction. So that's sort of termed scattered vagrancy, if you like. So these 3 ideas, which are again largely, there's been sort of some experimental evidence to support some of them, but again, we don't really know what's going on with this. And again, in the book, we talk about a lot of this uncertainty, because when you start unpacking some of the examples, well, some of the patterns we think emerge don't hold up when you look at other regions, etc. But all of these appear to be mistakes which don't seem too far-fetched to happen. It would seem quite easy to make any of these mistakes, basically. So we don't know necessarily the relative importance of these different mechanisms. It seems likely that these might happen. So some examples here in a European context, in sort of the autumn in the UK and indeed in much of Western Europe, we sort of anticipate the arrival of various Siberian, essentially, species or Eastern European species, which regularly occur in the autumn. And a lot of these have been mooted as being reverse migrants. So instead of migrating sort of southeast, and a lot of Siberian species sort of migrate initially east and then south. They sort of have to avoid the Himalayas, basically. So if you were to migrate, instead of mistaking north or south, you'd end up heading towards Europe, basically. An example here to explain this, using this concept of reverse migration shadows, are 2 species of Pseudo Vagrancy. So on the left, red-breasted flycatcher, on the right, collared flycatcher. This is an example initially taken from Cotteridge and Vinicum, a book on rare birds, which included some of these sort of speculative theories. So the idea here is that red-breasted flycatcher, its shadow of migration, which would normally migrate southeast, if it moves sort of northwest, if you like, takes it to the UK. Whereas for collared flycatcher, migrating towards Africa, this reverse migration shadow, if you like, sort of misses the UK. So this might explain why collared flycatcher is a lot rarer in the UK in autumn. Although that might also just be the case because collared flycatchers are very hard to separate from pied flycatchers in the autumn. And collared flycatchers are also much rarer globally than red-breasted flycatchers as well. So there are always sort of counter arguments about whether these patterns are real or if they reflect observer coverage, basically. So the hope there is sometimes looking at the sort of the old world isn't that useful, because there are huge gaps in our knowledge about where birds are in space and time. You know, there's not hundreds of thousands of e-birders collecting data in Russia. It's a huge black hole about what birds are doing there, and there's a huge black hole in big parts of the Afrotropics as well about where birds are. But in the new world, we've got a system which we've got a lot more data from. And therefore, we don't have some of those same massive observer biases, which are quite important if we want to understand where these patterns are. I mean, sure, there are huge areas of, you know, north of you guys, basically, where there's very few people and we don't know what's going on. There could be lots of vagrants showing up there, but, you know, if there's no one there to see them, then we don't know about them. But sort of south of Newfoundland, at least, and accepting, you know, parts of Amazonia, you know, there are big parts of Central South America and most of North America where we do know what is going on. There are gaps in coverage, and there are areas we know a lot less about, parts of the interior of the Midwest, for instance, versus California or versus the East Coast. But equally, we have a much better idea. So we can produce all these beautiful models about where birds are, which take into account this huge spatial variation in bird abundance and this seasonality. So this is a map of Forktail Flycatcher, which is, well, between this and Scissortail Flycatcher, we sort of use these as quite useful sort of hobby horses or model species, if you like, because they're so easy to identify and find, if you like. You know, everyone recognizes a Scissortailed or a Forktail Flycatcher, so they're not being missed like some Empidanax Flycatcher or difficult to identify Philoscopus warbler in Europe, right? I mean, if one of these lands on your washing line, you know, your neighbors have noticed that something weird's going on and have told their neighbors, and eventually news gets out, and these birds get found in a way that many little brown jobs won't do. So the nominant here, subspecies of Forktail Flycatcher, breeds in the southern cone of South America, you know, migrates north, mostly to the Llanos in Venezuela, passing through Amazonia, and then migrates back on a sort of a loop migration, more than these arrows depict here. And we know that, you know, we regularly get vagrants of this species in North America, in fact, throughout North America, but, you know, concentrated a lot in sort of East North America. And a lot of these vagrants sort of occur in the austral spring, which is the boreal autumn, if you like. So, you know, they're turning up in like November, you know, where you guys are. And that sort of corresponds perhaps to these birds, which should have been starting their spring migration, you know, heading back to breed in the austral summer. You know, it should be arriving in October time. Instead of heading south, it may be that they've failed to account for this flip in being in the north versus the southern hemisphere, and they failed to account for this change in the compass heading that's required, and end up in North America. And there are a suite of species which this might be a good model for. And again, a similar thing happens in Afrotropical systems as well. They get various vagrants to South Africa, which also occur, you know, at the season when they should be migrating back to the Palearctic. We get things like citrine wagtails occurring in South Africa in May and June, when, you know, presumably they've been migrated for 2 months south rather than north, even though they made their first migration, presumably correctly, to, you know, Central and Northern African wintering grounds. So, you know, there's these patterns we see recurring, you know, at large spatial scales throughout the world. In the animated map here, you can see, this isn't the map you'll see online. This is the map that hasn't been cleared up to account for these vagrants, but you see now, we see this flash of records from the northeast here. We also see Transandean records also occurring at a similar season, with these birds essentially overshooting down at this time here to occur on the coast of Chile, where again the bird doesn't it's not in the bird's regular geographic range, if you like. So there've been some works on orientation on vagrants using these Emlyn funnels, where you can sort of put a bird overnight in a funnel, and then look at the direction the bird's trying to head with the sort of the scratches the bird makes on blotting paper. And people have done this work with trapping vagrants on the Faroe Islands, and shown that things like yellow-browed warblers and barred warblers, they're still trying to head west from the Faroes. These birds are heading out, presumably to almost certain doom in the North Atlantic, if they don't get lucky and get blown north to Iceland or something. So these birds, haven't been blown all the way to the Faroes. They're purposely migrating westward on a heading which is taking them, to presumably certain death, because they're rarely going to get the systems which will carry them across the Atlantic to you guys. I mean, we're very fortunate in the UK that our prevailing storm tracks come, from the southwest and head northeast towards Europe. So we get, regularly get North American vagrant land birds in Europe, whereas you guys very rarely get those species, unless sort of usually birds which have got to Iceland and then manage to get across, basically, rather than regular migrants heading north-south. We know they get out to the Atlantic. There's lots of records, lots of species in the Azores, but getting even further, it seems to be very difficult just because of the winds are never there to take them, basically. So mirror image, then, is this other idea. So it was sort of DeSante in California who really sort of went big on this idea of the birds mistaking east to west. And again, it comes with various predictions about what might happen, right? If blackpoll warbler is a more extensive geographic range than Blackburnian warbler, so it kind of comes to this prediction that actually we shouldn't maybe expect many Blackburnian warblers much further north in California if you look at these sort of reverse migration arrows, whereas for blackpoll, which is goes further north and further west, we might expect more records, for instance. So this has been an idea. People are trying to sort of compare between different species and think about, what might be expect based on these observed, or based on these models, if you like, of migratory orientation and possible deviant orientations, if you like. And so in Europe, we sort of pointed out with a series of papers, sort of starting in 2003, that a lot of these models, the reverse and the mirror, they come up wanting a bit in many occasions. You end up with birds like the pied wheatear here, which its reverse migration shadow ought to take it, never towards the United Kingdom, for instance. The same is true of black-throated thrush. But both of these are anticipated autumn vagrants here. So it can't be reverse or mirror here, which is taking these birds to Europe or to Western Europe. Likewise, the same is true of even our most regularly occurring Siberian vagrant in Europe, the yellow-browed warbler. The sort of a run line migration route would take them off to Iceland where they do occur, but there's lots of these birds are making it to Morocco and to the Azores, and found wintering in quite large numbers in the Canaries in recent years. So again, some of these theories have sort of come up a bit wanting about where these birds are showing up and why. And that's also the case of the Blackburnian here on the right and blackpoll warblers talked about earlier on. I mean, Blackburnian is far rarer than blackpoll in terms of absolute population sizes. But if you just look at where the records are and account for just the fact that there are a lot fewer Blackburnians, then the patterns of vagrant birds in Western US don't look that different to me. So that suggests to me that although mirror image misorientation may cause vagrancy, it's not a blank explanation for vagrancy, and there must be more things happening, and birds are occurring in all sorts of different directions. And this is a figure from the book then for Scissortail Flycatcher, which as long as goes 2003 in a paper we wrote in British Birds, it seemed to us as being the great example of a bird with a very, sort of circumscribed breeding range, narrow wintering range, but there were vagrants like everywhere. Everywhere you looked, from Bermuda to Alaska, the Scissortail Flycatchers basically, and further down south into Colombia and who knows where else. But really obvious bird, narrow migration route, vagrants all over the place, and that sort of it fits better this sort of scatter idea that birds can potentially be, migrants might potentially end up going in and all sorts of different trajectories, basically. So that's the sort of a quick overview on some of those mechanisms then, but there's also the endogenous causes then, or sorry, the exogenous, so wind drift. We know that storms at sea can move seabirds. We know that storms in sea can move land birds, and some incredible records out there lot of those detailed in the book, but a cool one here, well, not cool for the birds, obviously, was like, you know, hundreds and hundreds of pterodroma petrels, Atlantic petrels, which were wrecked in the interior of Brazil after the first South Atlantic hurricane, essentially, which is also indicative of potentially this role of climate change in driving, you know, some crazy vagrancy events moving forward. You know, we might get a brief boom in records of vagrants, but if that translates into crashes of bird populations, then we can quickly expect a bust. These two specimens, Atlantic petrel here, weren't from this occurrence. They're actually two which occurred at Tucuruí Reservoir in the Brazilian Amazon. So, you know, this southern hemisphere gadfly petrel, two records together on a newly filled reservoir, you know, 2 degrees south of the equator in Amazonia in 1984. So also worth bearing in mind, and this sort of comes back to our sort of almost our unconscious biases, right, of being, as we said earlier on, this sort of diurnal primate, right? We live our lives here at ground level, and what we perceive as being the atmosphere, it's just this sort of 2D thing above us, right? Blue sky. And in fact, the sky is this incredibly complex habitat with loads of stuff going on. There are winds moving in different directions at different altitudes, and birds have to navigate this constantly sort of changing skyscape. And there's lots that can go wrong, right? The birds want to pick where the wind is moving in the right direction at the right speed. They control the migration. They can easily get stuck in layers where the wind is moving in the wrong direction. They can't get out of that, it's too turbulent or whatever, and they can quickly become vagrants as well. This is intriguing now because we've got these sorts of toolkits online to be able to see wind at different altitudes, and birders here have really copped onto this recently. And you think you've got the perfect easterly wind coming in to bring birds to the UK from Europe, and it turns out that's at ground level, and 500 meters or a kilometer up where the birds might be, the wind's in the opposite direction. So there sort of was a lot to learn really about the way that birds interact with different sort of weather masses. And then I guess vagrancy science is also about understanding, well, which birds, right? Because there are some birds we get more of than others. So this is one of the first papers I wrote, which was led by Ian McLaren, who I met in that sort of couple of months. He visited Seal there, and we got talking, sort of mutual interest in these things, and he led this paper in IBIS in 2006, which we had this like traits-based analysis. So we looked at different life history traits like birds' body size, or which direction they were migrating, or how many of them there were, and their wing length, to try and understand, well, which migratory North American passerines occurred in Europe and which didn't, and why, and use some of his data as pre-bird, you know, on the abundance of these birds at different places along the East Coast, including tower kills, etc. Trying to understand why, you know, we've got hundreds of red-eyed vireos in the UK. You know, even I found a red-eyed vireo in the UK. It was one of the most exciting birding experiences for me, you know, finding a North American passerine in Europe. I've seen a few others as well. But, you know, there are lots of other species which we never get, for instance. So trying to understand this. So what we found then, and as Chris was alluding to earlier on, so written with Chris who's in the audience, at the time it's quite novel to have this sort of regression tree approach to this. You don't have to understand this. It's just a mechanism to sort of partial out this variation, understand which variables are important for what percentage of the variation in or occurrence or predict the occurrence of these birds. So basically, migrants, North American migrants occurring in Europe as vagrants would tend to be species which were larger bodied, you know, often, you know, bigger fat reserves, longer wing lengths, so more physiologically capable of flying for longer, naturally have a longer migration span. So that also comes back to sort of fat reserves. And if you are already predisposed to survive migrating for 2 days over water, because some of these birds do it anyway. Things like blackpolls, that's their normal migration, is migrating for 2 days over water. So you can get caught in a storm, fast moving wave depression. You know, you can be in Europe in 2.5 days, 3 days, you know, and you've got enough fat to survive. Lots of birds we never get, presumably because they get drifted out to sea, but they can't physically make it. You know, these birds die en route. And we see this looking at places like the Azores. You see things like the Azores having lots of records of scarlet tanager and dickcissels and these things which just clearly don't make it to Europe because, you know, they run out of steam on the way. And then birds with large population sizes like red-eyed vireo, and later migrants as well, because you're more likely to get caught up in storms. So it was quite obvious when you looked at it why these birds, you know, why the birds, which birds we got and which birds we didn't get. And what was cool was because we could also look at some of the residuals to this, look at some of the variation, birds which hadn't showed up. And one sort of negative residual was the eastern kingbird, which there were no Palearctic records for. And then, all of a sudden, like buses, we ended up with 2 Irish records and a British record, a few years later. And that was an expected migrant based on, it migrates to Brazil, it's got the fat reserves, etc. Maybe it's just because it was a bit rarer than a lot of these other species. It just meant we hadn't got one up to that point. And so, conscious of time, then I'm also quite interested in its movements in tropical birds, and I've written various papers showing that we have this sort of pervasive assumption of residency in tropical bird species, but actually many tropical bird species are migratory when we assume they weren't, simply because we didn't have the data. And now we've got all this system science data from things like eBird and WikiAvis, etc. We can show that many tropical bird species are also migratory and henceforth, predisposed to vagrancy. And then with some things like this sapphire quail dove, we have extranominal records which might be a vagrant, but because we know that geotrigan ground doves are often migratory, but then it might be a range extension. So sometimes we don't know if what we're dealing with is a vagrant, because we don't necessarily know where the bird is even. So this is, this sole record, a documented Brazilian record of this species, we still to this day don't know if it's a vagrant or maybe they just live there. And then other species like the white-necked Jacobin here, there's a couple of crazy extranominal records of a bird, which is really an Amazonian bird species, but records from Argentina here and eastern Brazil. This is a bird which is supposed to be a resident, but these records of vagrant suggest, well, this bird must be a migrant. To be getting these fairly regular detections of long distance movements, there must be some cryptic migration going on which we're not aware of. And that might not be all of the population, it might be just part of the population, but the vagrants are telling us something about movement in these species. So sort of brings on to the final part of my talk then, which is trying to think about, well, what does all this mean, right? Yeah, we all get excited about vagrants. Yes, it's not a major contribution to science finding an individual vagrant, but with all these records together, they kind of add up to tell a story that actually maybe this is quite an important biological phenomenon. And certainly it's not us, we're not the first people to talk about this. Grinnell, as far away as long ago as 100 years ago, was writing in the York about how he saw as vagrants might be these sorts of mechanisms by which species colonized distant areas, and it's got to be exactly that, really. And there's a blurred line, as we talked about earlier on, between a vagrancy and scarce migrants. A vagrant might be a bird who's inherited a deviant orientations, gone somewhere weird, but if that bird survives there and it returns and breeds and then goes back there, or other birds go back and starts, you get a new migration route evolving. And we see this, and I'll talk about some examples in a bit, but migration is a dynamic thing which has to change and adapt with changing climates and changing landforms. And where we are, both of where you guys are and where I am now was under a kilometer of ice 10,000 years ago, and bird migration systems were very, very different then. And everything we've seen now has changed since then. So bird migration routes must be dynamic to adapt to changes in the Earth system. So in 2003, we coined this term as pseudo vagrancy, which is this idea that, some of these regular vagrants might not be vagrants at all. They're not lost. They're just, the founding members of new populations. So this paper was sort of, at the time, some people were very sort of naysaying about it, sort of didn't buy into the idea. But at the time, we said that Rich's pipit was probably the best example of this, because it seemed to be, it was so regular in Europe. And then last year, Paul Dufour and collaborators put a load of geolocators on Rich's pipits in where they've been found in the Mediterranean basin. I think it's Paul. Can you turn your mic off?
Ukrainian officials have spoken about bringing these spiders home, perhaps.
Thanks. So Rich's pipit, which is basically a Siberian species which migrates to winter in the Indian subcontinent, normally occurs fairly regularly in Europe, but always seen as a vagrant. But it occurs so regularly, there must be something going on. So Paul Dufour and co, they caught these birds in the south of France and in Spain. They put these geolocators on them to measure light levels. They were able to track these birds back all the way to Siberia. They're breeding, and then they were returning back to the same areas in Spain and France in the following year. So, we've got a migration route. These birds aren't vagrants. They're a very small subpopulation of rich pipits which migrate to Europe every year. And, you know, who knows, in 10,000 years, maybe all the rich pipits migrate to Europe because there's no habitat for them in Asia. Maybe this population disappears in 10 years time, but that's the idea here. I mean, migration routes are dynamic, and these changes can happen, you know, quite quickly. Something that they argued in the paper that climate change has permitted the species to sort of colonize Europe, but we argued in a sort of a commentary piece afterwards that although, you know, if you look at the difference between Bligh's pipit here and Rich's pipit, you see a similar sort of spread of records in both. There's no evidence of sort of Bligh's pipit colonizing Europe. There is for Rich's pipit, but there's this guy Heinrich Gatke, this German ornithologist. He was getting loads of Rich's pipits on the island of Helgoland in the North Sea like 130 years ago. He said he was seeing up to 100 in a day, which suggests to us that this isn't a new phenomenon. You know, that climate change is permitted. It's been going on for a long time, but, you know, just maybe there weren't people looking at salt marshes in the south of Spain and France, you know, to find these birds. So it could be a lot more complicated, and there's still this legacy of what we think we know about birds, which is causing problems. For lesser black-backed gull, that's a classic example of a former vagrant to North America, which has subsequently colonized Greenland, and now we're getting, you know, this new migration route of lesser black-backed gulls, you know, down East North America, now hundreds sort of wintering, you know, if you go down to Florida. We know these birds are the Greenland birds because they've been satellite tagged in New England, and they've already penetrated all the way down as far as Brazil. So this is the first Brazilian record from a paper from a few years ago, and now, you know, wintering in small numbers in North and South America. So, you know, very quickly we've gone from a bird which is a vagrant. You know, the first, well, I did my undergrad degree in California, and I visited sort of Connecticut in 2001. I've got like a family out there, an aunt and uncle, and I twitched a lesser black-backed gull in Connecticut, which had a name. It was called Chester, and it was this lesser black-backed gull which came back every year. And no one's naming lesser black-backed gulls anymore, right? Because there's loads of them. So that's changed in 22 years. It's gone from a rare bird to an expected migrant, and you know, these systems are dynamic and really big picture. Then, as I alluded to right at the beginning, if we didn't have, you know, vagrancy, there would be no birds on islands. You know, everything that reaches oceanic islands is a vagrant. So, you know, no vagrancy, no speciation on islands. Also, you know, if all birds move loads, well, you wouldn't have loads of species in the tropics because mountain ranges wouldn't divide ranges of tapaculos. So there's this push-pull in dispersal of birds, which means that, you know, we have very low dispersal in some species, equals lots of species, very high dispersal in some other species equals lots of species because they make migrants. So without this dispersal continuum in birds, there'd be a lot fewer birds out there, basically. You think about Hawaii, right in the middle of the Pacific, you know, an amazing avifauna, and unfortunately loads of it's going extinct. You know, think about this spectacular radiation of the Hawaiian honey creepers. What are they descended from? Well, it turns out they're descended from common rose finches. You know, common rose finch at some point vagrated, presumably a flock of them, well, had to be a flock of them, to Hawaii, eventually evolved into this amazing radiation of these spectacular endemic birds, right? And still to this day, this happens occasionally, right? There's been flocks of bramblings recorded on Hawaii. You know, I mean, 12 bramblings occurring as a flock. And it's that sort of event which gives rise over time. You know, all those birds died and had gone by the following spring, but you know, 500 years ago, 10,000, 100,000 years ago, events happen like this. Some of those birds stayed. You know, it was a flock of rose finches that translated into this, you know, 120 species of honey creepers over evolutionary time. So really, really important. And then we've got movement of ships now. So we humans are interfering in this process. We're moving birds around. There's even a record of a brambling on a boat in the sort of this is on a cruise from Juneau to Japan, for instance, so sort of south of the Bering. So we know that ships move birds around as well. And so sort of this is finishing off on our last paper of ours that sort of talks about this difference, this continuum, because you've got some species like barn swallow, which they make it to every island, but they're also really good at leaving. Barn swallow ends up as a vagrant in Hawaii. It's like, oh God, that was a bad idea, and leaves. It could potentially even make it back to, you know, pinball across the Pacific via islands and might survive, right? But if that was you know, various other species, if it was moved by, you know, a freak weather event or whatever, perhaps much less likely to move because of the stress of the crossing. And we see this with some sort of partial migrants or more resident species here, which often stay a long time, whereas migrants are far more likely to leave, which means that it's not always the most migratory species which tend to be birds which colonize islands. It's more migratory species which occur as vagrants, but they don't always colonize islands, which is, again, quite an interesting thing. And then vagrancy is a process, right? Records of vagrant peregrines, perhaps ship-assisted on subantarctic islands, potentially imperiling entire species like the McGillivrary's prion. So this vagrant peregrine ate like 10% of all the prions. There's a similar record of a vagrant peregrine eating 5% of all the laysan finches as well. So, even individuals can have like a disruptive impact on bird populations. And then, a bird itself is an island, right? Birds contain pathogens, they contain parasites internally and externally. They can also contain seeds within their gut, which are viable, even viable fish eggs. A vagrant mallard could be blown across the Pacific, land on Hawaii, die, but then, do a poo and then excrete eggs, viable fish eggs and viable seeds, which go on to evolve into new species of plants and fish. So, these sort of events, they might be rare. They might be rare, but they can still have this hugely important biological significance. And we're only just getting sort of grips with this now. And even then, we've got records of vagrants which end up being killed by authorities. So records, especially the Australians and New Zealanders, are particularly bad at this. They've had a vagrant rose-crowned fruit dove, which was euthanized as like a biohazard. But essentially, this is the mechanism by which birds evolve and adapt. And in the face of this, global change, we need, mechanisms we need these birds to be able to do these things to adapt to the way we're changing the planet. So there's also a demand now to sort of recognize the biological importance of vagrants and protect them, because in the long haul, they may be very important. So that's it from me. So we've written a book which discusses a lot of these ideas, and co-written with James Gilroy here at the bottom here, who's been sort of a partner in crime for me for writing about vagrancy and thinking about vagrancy for a long time. So apologies if I've got over time. I think it's 46 minutes here, so I think I've had a couple of extras, but hope that was at least vaguely interesting. Work out to stop sharing here as well. So just pause share or?
That was awesome, Alex. On behalf of the Nova Scotia Bird Society, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and a special thanks to yourself for a very informative talk. I also encourage you to check out our website, the Nova Scotia Bird Society, and our Facebook page. And if you're not a member, consider joining as a paid member as well. And now let's throw it open. What questions have folks got for Alex, please?
Feel free to type in the chat as well, otherwise, but I'm happy to take them, switch on your mics or whatever. Chris has got his hand up.
Yes, thank you. It was a great talk, and just wondered, do people getting any sense of which families of birds are more likely to be successful in establishing themselves in new habitats?
So as sort of colonizers, then, so it tends to be the generalists, right? So like corvids, for instance, are very, very good at colonizing areas. Even sort of house crow is spectacular at colonizing areas, and they've even sort of use boats as their vector for dispersal, for instance. So in the Anthropocene, the sort of geological age we live in, we sort of simplify habitats and we create new habitats like cities for which there's no historical precursor, right? And it's the intelligent birds, the generalists, which tend to be better at colonizing, and often colonizing islands as well. And we have, in fact, there's a whole guild of birds which are called like super tramps. This is a phraseology of Diamond from years ago. These birds that always perpetual colonizers, for instance. There's even a super tramp fantail, which is a bird which is always a colonizer of new islands, but eventually gets replaced by newer lineages and species which take longer to disperse as well. So there's almost this succession we get in avian communities too.
Thank you.
That's right.
Is your book going to be available on Amazon Kindle or paperback or hardback only, or what?
I believe there's, well, at least in Europe, there's a Kindle online version as well, I think. If you look at the Princeton University Press is who's selling it in the States, I think they're certainly on offer both of those. It's not softback, yeah, as far as I'm aware, but it's hardback and Kindle, I guess.
Thank you.
That was a great talk, Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And one question I had is about some species. They seem to have vagrated a lot in previous decades, whereas in more recent decades, their records seem to have dried up. And one species that I've talked to a lot of people about recently is Fulvous whistling duck. And if you look on eBird, there's tons of records from the 70s and 80s in Canada and the northern US. And more recently, there doesn't seem to be nearly as many. Is there any speculation for that?
So I don't know a lot about Fulvous whistling ducks. I know a bit more about black belly whistling ducks, which seem to be, we just talking about earlier on, seems to become more common. So has Fulvous whistling ducks range contracted in the Caribbean or in Central America? That would be the first question, right? I mean, that you get more vagrant species which are generally commoner. It's not always the case because there's what we call an alley effect, which could happen with some species. As they get rarer, they might be more likely to end up hooking up with a flock of the wrong species, something like a sociable lapwing, for instance. But in most cases, the more birds there are, the more likely they are to be vagrants. I guess the second question there is could some of those birds have been escapes, and was there more Fulvous whistling ducks escaping is another possibility, although I don't want to claim that all whistling ducks are escapes. I mean, some are, but a lot of them are genuine vagrants too. So that will be I'd look to work out first, what's the population trend with Fulvous whistling ducks? Have we seen a range contraction away from the core, for instance? Because it's a bird which we should be seeing more of, even if populations contract a bit, because there's simply more people looking too. So it's quite surprising if it has declined. And when we see that in Europe, it tends to be because the bird itself has declined. So in the UK, things like tawny pipits, which were regular vagrant, are now very rare because the entire population is contracted south, and with agricultural intensification, it's now a very rare bird in northern France. And things like bustards, which are disappearing from Europe as well, are now very rare as vagrants. So I can't give you an exact reason why, but I'd look into population first as a potential driver.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. As far as I know, the population hasn't declined, but someone might know more than me. It's been interesting. Thanks.
I have to look into that afterwards, and I'm intrigued.
Hey, Alex. Great talk. I was just curious about the yellow crowned night herons. They're in recent years they've really they've become almost a regular fall species here. So would you consider that sort of juvenile dispersion to be like range expansion, like cattle egrets, or would it just be, weather or kind of something throwing them this direction?
Well, it could be all. So isn't yellow crown night heron is expanding northwards, right?
It would seem so, yeah.
Yeah. So it's the same. Something like all the southern herons here in Europe are getting commoner as well. So it's a climate change. Plus here it's also a habitat availability effect, because we've spent a lot of money restoring wetlands. So some of these species have expanded north because there's more habitat, but a lot of them are also limited by winter temperatures. A lot of them are sort of partially resident. So if you get a cold winter, they'll die. We don't get cold winters, so there's more of them. So then therefore expanding north. And as the further they get north, then the more vagrants you receive, because ultimately you have to draw a line between where the range is and where the vagrants are. And you cross that line, and the bird's more abundant there and gets rarer and rarer the further north you go. So a combination of more people looking, plus the birds expanding northwards, potentially there could be weather impacts. We do see that on a decadal scale here. We see trends where sometimes we get springs, like this spring here in Europe. It's been very cold, lots of northerlies, shut down, a lot of overshooting. Historically, 10 years ago, there was a trend for more southerlies, so more vagrancy. So there can be a mix of these things. But I think with the southern herons and the yellow crown in particular, things like black vulture, you're just seeing as the range expands northwards, well, you're just going to get more vagrants until it's no longer a vagrant and they're breeding on your doorstep.
Yeah, and the green crab invasive species seems to be helping them along, because almost every picture you see of them, they're just butchering green crabs.
Yeah. So we talk about.
I've watched them. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's a great example. So in the book we talk about limpkin. So these apple snails been introduced into some of the Gulf Coast states, and limpkins colonizing these areas as well, and hence colonizing new areas, and you're getting loads more limpkin vagrancy. So I didn't know about the night herons. So that's quite interesting because it's sort of a similar example where you've got this invasive is changing distribution of northern species, which is then impacting this sort of vagrants as being the expanding fringe of a growing population, which many of them are. So sort of Richard Veet has written a lot about this. He seems very convinced that that's the major driver of vagrancy, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But the vagrants certainly are also the result of a growing fringe, sort of part of that fringe expansion too.
I could just add a note about that. Someone speculated recently about the yellow-crowned night herons that originally a few years ago, they were nearly all immatures in mid to late summer and increasing numbers, which we've all noted, but that more adults are showing up later in the season as well, as though the birds have learned a new habit. And I suspect that's the case, judging by what you've said before.
So that might be the form of like a new post-breeding migration. And we see that where you've got birds might migrate north to exploit a seasonal food resource. Maybe it's they can't nest there for whatever habitat reason or whatever else, but they'll migrate north to take advantage of a new food resource. And that
exactly.
could still be a precursor to colonization in itself. But yeah, it's another cool example. I'll have to write both of these. I'll certainly be writing both these down. Yellow-crowned night herons and fulvous whistling ducks to look at.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting talk. I have one question. Can you tell me why I find that North American ornithologists don't use high split models to try to explain particular cases of vagrancy?
Use did you say habitat split models?
High split models. They're produced by, it's interesting that you don't know what it is. It's produced by the NOAA in the United States. And it was originally to plot the trajectory of air pollution. And if basically in your book, you talk about birds sort of giving in to a tailwind and drifting. And in a high split model, you can plot forward trajectories and backward trajectories at different altitudes to see if a bird did such a thing at such a place, where would it end up depending on which altitude it was at when it got caught.
Yeah, well, I guess the issue there is, you could use that, but you'd need to sort of understand the trajectory of the vagrant beforehand, right? We sort of need some satellite tagged vagrants, or to know exactly where they are in space and time. Otherwise, you have all sorts of assumptions that you don't know when that bird occurred there. So I guess people have used those sort of techniques for regular migrants, right? Because there's loads of beautiful papers looking at sort of boundary layer movements and sort of atmospheric models, but we just haven't got there with vagrants yet because we've not got the sort of underlying data about movements. But I'm sure that's coming. I'll certainly look into it. I mean, again, I don't really work on migration that much. I work on conservation, so I'm not up to date with all the lit on that. But it certainly sounds interesting. Oh, I can mention it to James, who does a lot more sort of migration modeling work too.
Yeah, just in terms of the first part of your response, you can do backward trajectories, so that if you find a vagrant at a particular place at a particular time, you can do a backward trajectory.
Sure, but the issue is there you don't know. That's just when you found it. You don't know when that bird occurred there. That's the challenge, I guess. But yeah, you have to make assumptions, and I guess with enough birds and enough records, you can probably make assumptions about when they may have occurred. So
yes. Good, thank you for that.
No, thank you.
Do we have any more questions for anybody out there?
Jason has his hand up. Was that from prior or?
That's from before. Sorry, I'll put it down. Oops.
You've got to ask another question now.
Yeah. 25 years in IT and I can't figure out how to put my hand down.
Well, sounds like a very informative chat, and I really, on behalf of the society, I want to thank you, Alex. It was fascinating, and My good lady's certainly got a lot of questions to ask and to study now.
Well, it's open for everyone, this, right? There's so much uncertainty. There's lots of hypotheses, and we've got lots of data on pattern, but we really don't know that much about process. And I feel like, having written the book, I know much less. I think we know less than we thought we did. But I think we're in a position to start knowing.
We're getting a far bigger data set now with eBird, etc. to work with, that's growing all the time. And so
even then, it's extracting the right data from eBird, because you got so many individual records of the same bird. So we were trying to work on this a while ago, and me and Marshall Iliff, and it's like, how do you work out when you've got like 1,000 records of one bird and it's one vagrant? And so how are you at scale? How do you extract the data out to get the single record of the one individual, which is the bird? So there's operational challenges, but we'll get there, I'm sure.
Yeah, and also there's a big future in audio monitoring as well, I think, as well. And John Kearney, who was on chatting earlier, is our go-to guy in Nova Scotia for audio monitoring, and it's a fascinating subject. And I'm sure a lot more stuff to come out in the future.
I do a lot of sort of ecoacoustic stuff. A postdoc and former PhD who's been leading on this. But I mean, in the UK, there's this big knock-mig scene, and we've had records of things like great spotted cuckoo as nocturnal migrants, and semi-palmated plover first recorded, from someone's garden, in Ireland, and then it was only found like a month later on the beach, basically. So, it's amazing what these things will produce, and especially when they're automated, you just get a text message from your phone saying there's a Connecticut warbler singing in your garden or whatever.
My God, Big Brother is really taking over.
Yep. I'd love to see a Connecticut warbler, so if my phone tells me one, I'm not going to get upset with it.
Yeah, the days of walking around with a pair of binoculars and a Sibley's field guide in your pocket seem to be going, but I'm still a bit...
Can I ask a question before we wrap it up, Tony?
Yeah.
Alex, I just wanted to ask, what do you see as the way ahead? Is it going to be experimental or data mining, or some combination of the two?
I think some combination of two. So the Defoe paper on rich bits it's absolutely fantastic paper, right? It just ended all that controversy, and it was great that it ended in favor of our hypothesis we wrote as undergrads, in the pub, basically. But that's it. So that's experimental trackers, and then there's lots that can be done with big data, I think, and there's more modeling stuff I think that can be done to think about, well, what would these trajectories look like? Can we fit observed records with these trajectories? I'm surprised no one's done that. So me and James keep talking about doing that, but you end up having to do your day job, and we just expect, well, one day you're going to open up Google Scholar and it's going to tell us this is the paper, and it'll be like, oh great, at least someone's written it, whilst being secretly gutted that we didn't write it ourselves. But yeah, I'm sure we will see all these things. It's a very exciting time to sort of be a student of vagrancy, simply because historically there's always been this sort of mantra in science that in ornithology, never study rare species, right? Because you never have enough data. But we're now living in an age where there is that data. We've got the analytical toolkits to deal with it, as has just been mentioned. All these environmental data layers, fantastic stuff. And I think sort of now is really the sort of time to do a lot of these studies.
Yeah, it's terrific. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, folks, if that's it for the questions, let's call it a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you out in the field. Good birding, everybody. And again, thanks to Alex.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.